Hello and welcome to Priya's Corner. Well, this is where you come for all the political buzz, the whispers from the corridors, the color from the campaign field, and also take away from books that I have read. In fact, today I have with me Mr. Shankar Aiyar, and we're going to be talking about his latest book on Rajiv Gandhi, The Rajiv I Knew, and why he was India's most misunderstood Prime Minister. But Mr. Aiyar, a bit about your equation with Rajiv Gandhi and why this book.
Well, unlike a popular perception that we were great school chums, the fact of the matter is that I didn't know the man at all until he inducted me into his Prime Minister's office. And I was given a specific task, like each one of us was given a specific task and put into virtually isolated compartments. So I was in no wise his political confidant. So this book is not based on personal experience. It's based on a great deal of research, which I did nearly 30 years after he'd been assassinated. Of course, it is interspersed with some personal memories, but the substance of it is largely the result of looking up the documentation in newspapers, magazines, the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha records, and whatever other documentation I could find. I think it's necessary to stress that far from being a quasi-political excuse for Rajiv Gandhi, it is a quasi-academic explanation of his 5 years in office and his 1 year or 1.5 years in opposition.
In fact, so it is more, you're wearing a journalist hat more than...
No, I'd say a historian's hat. I think since the journalist fraternity doesn't like me, they wouldn't want to add me to them.
And I can see the feeling is reciprocated. But a bit about him, as Congress president, we've talked about him as Prime Minister, pluses and minuses, which we'll go into. As Congress president, you also write he wanted to democratize the Congress. He was, in fact, before Rahul spoke about all this, having elections to the working committee, Rajiv had actually begun the process.
Yes, absolutely. And he nominated Shankar Dikshit, who was then about the same age as I am now, to prepare a report on how to rejuvenate the Congress party, particularly its organization. And Shankar's recommendation was that we must begin by democratizing the party at its grassroots, and by a process of elections reach the topmost position of the president. And this report came out when Rajiv was still the Prime Minister. And he found that his colleagues were not ready to implement it. So the first thing he did when he went into opposition was to convene a big meeting, an extended meeting of the working committee, and get them to endorse the Shankar Dikshit report. And then that endorsement was taken to the All India Congress Committee, which met in Mavlankar Hall in New Delhi in July of 1990, and he got them to pass it. And he was just beginning the process of implementation when VP Singh's government got into trouble in August of 1990, 1 month later. And then, of course, his attention was on what to do with the debris of the VP Singh government rather than what to do with the debris of the Congress. And the intention was that once these processes were over, he would revert to the Shankar Dikshit report. But you can see, I've written about it here, how despite even Priyanka attempting to help me find a copy of the report, there is no copy of the Shankar Dikshit report available in the records or the archives of the Congress party as it is constituted today. So, Shankar Dikshit's report has been effectively wiped out of Congress memory, despite the fact that Rajiv Gandhi had ensured that the party as a whole, at all different levels, had endorsed that report. I wish we had, and I think we would have posed a much bigger and effective challenge to the Modi dispensation had we followed the Shankar Dikshit recommendations.
The report which is missing and
the
cannot
report
be found.
which is simply not available.
Okay, you write that you joined him as a, from IFS officer, and then over years, when the government came out of power, you wanted to actually fight an election on a Congress ticket. Tell us a bit about your entry into politics and how you said you were the only rat to jump onto a sinking ship because you joined at a time the Congress was at a low.
Yeah, well, I had my interest in electoral politics dated back to the 1952 election, when I was 10 years old. I was so excited about watching what was happening around me that I even organized an election in my school, which was a preparatory school. And then I got very interested in debating, and I eventually at Cambridge ran for President of the Union. And that is when I learnt, but only 20 years later, that Rajiv, whom I didn't know at all at Cambridge, after all, he belonged to the rich set, and I was impecunious. He was squiring Sonia to the best restaurants in town, while I was looking for a girlfriend who'd cook for me. So this was my condition. I didn't know him then. Then he became a pilot, so why would I have interacted with him? And I was abroad most of the time in the Foreign Service. So I only got to know him when he inducted me into his Prime Minister's office. But over that time, in the work that was given to me, I saw a statesman whom I admired and whose goals and values I shared. And therefore I decided that if ever I was going to make the leap into politics, and I'd always wanted to be in politics rather than be a civil servant, this was the opportunity. So I asked Rajiv in August. He wouldn't give me permission to resign till October. And he had me cased out by everybody around him, including his principal secretary. And then they told him that I was adamant on leaving and that he had no alternative but to either accept or reject. So then he called me in and he said that the system will never accept you. He said it has not accepted Arun Nehru, it hasn't accepted Arun Singh. And I've often thought afterwards that he also wanted to say, but didn't, that the system has not accepted me. And he said that I'll never be able to make you a minister. I said, I don't mind, but I just want to be in Parliament. And he said, that I can arrange. In fact, he was wrong. He couldn't arrange my entry into the Rajya Sabha, which he had thought he would do from the Delhi Metropolitan Corporation. But that's just as well. So eventually when I said, he gave me permission. And after he gave me permission, it moved very quickly. And I was able to resign from the Foreign Service before the election of 1989. And I accompanied Rajiv on that trip. And I could see that disaster was facing us, especially after the Shilanyas, which was the worst political decision that he had ever taken. It ended up with the Muslims being angry that he'd started the process of building a temple, and the Hindus being angry that he hadn't destroyed the masjid. So where Dhawan had recommended that you get the Muslim vote by saving the mosque and the Hindu vote by doing the Shilanyas, exactly the opposite happened. And where he had won his previous election by the largest majority ever, he lost the next election in 1989 by the largest difference ever. He lost more than half his seats. I think it was down to 192. So in these circumstances, I have written this book by looking at the records rather than dealing with it in terms of personal reminiscences. Although my personal reminiscences do come in, for instance, on Kashmir.
In fact, quickly, we've talked about Rajiv and his domestic, policies. A little bit about him, either in his international policies, his going to Pakistan, China.
His two most important initiatives were all undertaken in the month of December 1988. But of course, the preparation for that had gone on for 3 years. The first visit was to China. He was the first Prime Minister in India in nearly 30 years to visit China. And he had very clear objectives in his mind. The most important of them was to ensure peace and tranquility on the border, allowing space for a negotiation on where exactly the border lay. And in both these, he was so successful that for 35 years, until Modi came to power, we did have peace and tranquility on the border. There was hardly any incident after Sumdo Rongchi which had military implications for us. There was peace, there was tranquility. And the process of negotiating the border began. We had 18 rounds of talks, which began at the Foreign Secretary level, but were then raised to the level of the National Security Advisor in India and the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs in China. But because Rajiv was not there, where he had expected, and he said it publicly in China, the border to be settled in a short period of time, but with some give and take, but the positions of the two countries being largely respected. We took 18 rounds and got nowhere. And then, of course, the whole thing was disturbed by what happened in 2020. And we've never recovered from that. So it was Rajiv's initiative in China, which was the only constructive initiative after the Hindi-Chini bye-bye period. As for Pakistan, he became the first Indian Prime Minister in 28 years to visit Pakistan. And that was for the SAARC summit. And now, because the SAARC summit is due to take place in Pakistan, we have closed down SAARC for the best part of 10 years. Tragic. But anyway, to go back to Rajiv, he went in December of 1988. And I've now learned, and I've explained that in the book, that he had sent Ronan Sen in advance on a secret mission to talk to Benazir Bhutto to get something specific out of a bilateral meeting with her. And they decided to focus on Siachen. And Siachen was therefore touched upon when Rajiv became the only SAARC leader to remain in Islamabad after the conference ended. And that half day was described as a bilateral visit. But obviously, Benazir was not satisfied with it, nor was Rajiv. So it was decided that he would make a formal state visit the following year. And that took place on the 16th of July, 1989. And he delivered a banquet speech there, in which he broke completely new ground on what India should be dealing with Pakistan. He referred particularly to the very deep relations we had at the people-to-people level and how it was necessary to build on those relations in order to have at least a viable relationship between India and Pakistan. And specifically, Siachen was picked upon as the issue which should be resolved. And to this end, a process was initiated. But by the beginning of 1990, when he was no longer the Prime Minister, the situation in Kashmir deteriorated very, very remarkably. And that was largely because of the end of the jihad in Afghanistan, which meant that many of those jihadis were diverted to Kashmir. And Benazir had to call off the process. But it was resumed immediately after, in 1991, by Narasimha Rao. And I have described here the meeting that took place at the beginning of October 91 between the two defense secretaries, N.N. Vora in India and Salim Abbas Jilani in Pakistan. And they actually arrived at an agreement on Siachen. And they actually announced that they were going to sign the Siachen agreement in the presence of the media at Hyderabad House the following morning at 10 o'clock. And N.N. Vora has told me, I've recounted it here, how at 9 o'clock at night, Narasimha Rao called him and asked him to rush to Racecourse Road. And when Vora arrived there, he said, I can't allow the signature to take place. And he didn't give the explanation. But the explanation became clear after this process on the Babri Masjid was ended by the destruction of that masjid. And that is that they were coming to some kind of an agreement on the Babri Masjid. And Advani said that he could not sell a settlement with Narasimha Rao on the Babri Masjid if at the same time relations with Pakistan were being improved through the Siachen Agreement. And therefore, that night, Jilani was telephoned in the Ashok Hotel. And I know Jilani very well from my days in Karachi. So he's recounted it to me. And I know Vora very well from his days in the Defense Ministry and as governor of J&K. So I've checked out the story with both of them on the telephone, and then it's recounted here. I think it's the first time that the story of Siachen is being told. I also think it's the first time the story of Jammu and Kashmir is being told.
What is quickly the story of Jammu and Kashmir? We are out of time, but I think there is a story here, so I'll...
It is essentially that the VP Singh government made a big mistake in succumbing to BJP pressure to put Jagmohan as the governor. And they realized their own mistake when within 4 months, they removed Jagmohan, 5 months, they removed Jagmohan from the governorship and sent Saxena as the new governor. So it was that 4-month period when Jagmohan was the governor. He was called Halaku Khan by the people of Kashmir. That the relationship with Kashmiri people, especially the Muslims, deteriorated as much as it did. And I have quoted from an RTI response that was given to somebody from Haryana who sought the information as to how many Muslims were killed during that period. And it turns out that it was 1,800 as against 89 Hindus. I quoted that. So therefore, the portrayal, what happened was absurd violence on everybody in Kashmir.
And that is when the Kashmir situation really spiraled.
That's when the Kashmir situation deteriorated and now has been aggravated by what the Modi government have done. I mean, the entire audience at Modi's big meeting were of government servants who were forced to come.
Well, that is a conversation for another time. We have, of course, elections round the corner. The Congress is yet to decide on the candidature from your seat, which is a space we shall be watching very closely. But until then, all the best, and thank you so much, Mr. Aiyar, for talking to us. That's all for now. Thank you.